A couple months back, I was watching the news as I always do, and yes, before you judge me, my idea of a fun Saturday night is binge watching CNN. But anyways, I was sitting there watching the news when suddenly headlines broke out over the screen reading, "Breaking news, 72 dead after chemical attack in Syria." My heart sank. I kept on flipping back and forth from the different news stations, all covering the same barbaric, inhumane tragedy which shook me to the core. The Middle East and the refugee crisis is one which I connect to on a deep level and spend a lot of my time reading and learning more about. It's an issue I care for very profoundly. Learning more about the conflicts arising in the Middle East spurred an interest in terrorism, specifically its evolution. It really only feels like a few years ago I was sitting on the same couch watching a news broadcast of the Boston Marathon bombing. But this was unlike anything I'd ever seen. My mind became occupied with thoughts about how terrorism is metamorphosizing into a stealthier, beastly creature, highly unconventional, and highly unexpected. So naturally, after hearing of this attack, I looked more in depth into the issue. I learned about the sarin nerve gas, which caused innocent Syrian children to froth at the mouth and convulse on the ground as they desperately gasped for air. I went to bed that night and kept on angrily thinking to myself, how could someone use such a brutal way to hurt others? Reporters were echoing my thoughts. This is like unlike anything we've ever seen, and chemical warfare is on the rise. Chemical warfare? What's that? Fast forward a few weeks, I was on the bus flipping through my news app when I read of a cyber attack that had encrypted their victims' files on their computers and demanded a ransom in the currency of Bitcoin. This attack was called the WannaCry ransomware account and affected over 230,000 people in over 150 countries. 230,000. That's as if every single student at CIS was hacked 77 times. 77. Then, a short time after, another attack on an American nuclear power plant, which the hackers shut down. And another, where a dam in New York State was breached, and so on and so forth. Reporters were once again reading my mind, with headlines such as, "Ransomware attacks are on the rise and we're in danger." I thought about that statement, "we're in danger." What if it had been me? What if it had been you who had your files encrypted? Every single one of us is at risk of being compromised. Isn't that crazy? You see, we're being reborn into this new era, driven by innovation and technology, where 10 years ago, no one could have even imagined facing terrorism and widespread destruction through the simple click of a mouse. Talk about cyber terrorism became ever more concentrated on the news and across the world. Wait, cyber terrorism? What's that? You see, that's the funny thing about terrorism. When we hear that word, we use something called word association, where we bring about immediate ideas, concepts, images, visuals to that word. So, here's a look at what showed up when I typed terrorism into the Google Images bar. When we hear terrorism, we think of large-scale bombs, guns, planes crashing into buildings, which is exactly what we see here, the ultimate destruction of our society through guns, bombs, and planes. See the pattern? Terrorism is a concept that we know of, but is, quote, not our problem or something we aren't at risk of. Think again. I kindly ask you to kick that notion to the curb for the rest of this talk and disregard your idea or word association of terrorism. And at the end, I'd like for you to think about if there's more to terrorism than what meets the eye, or if your word association or interpretation of it has changed. So, what does terrorism look like 10 years from now? Well, a lot will change in 10 years, that's undeniable, where things are going to become ever more unconventional, unorthodox, and even creative in a sense. The gears have already started to turn. So let's look at this whole ransomware mumbo-jumbo, because the question still lies, what is cyber terrorism? We'll revisit chemical warfare in a while. So, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you, without further ado, the future of terrorism, cyber terrorism. Now, cyber terrorism or cyber warfare has a large slew of assailants: lone wolves, political or ideological extremist groups, hacktivists, companies, and yes, even governments. Now, of course, whoever the attacker, each has their own motives, but with that comes various different types of threats. So today, we'll focus on 3: espionage, sabotage, and propaganda. Cyberspying or espionage is when an attacker or attackers infiltrate a system to obtain confidential information. This is often described as attacks on the victim. Now, espionage is extremely dangerous as it can become as severe as the compromisation of national security, leaving an entire country at risk. But of course, where is cyberspying heading? These attackers can tap into any form of information they'd like, but on a global scale is where foreign governments can become involved in order to benefit their country from a security standpoint. If war were to break out, governments may hire or use hackers to spy on another country's intelligence communications to gain tactical advantage at war or learn about where troops are located. I cannot stress this enough. This is huge. Imagine, for example, ISIS militant forces were aware of every single game plan and every single tactical move American forces in Iraq and Syria had. Surely the rebel forces and the American forces could crumble, and this would effectively change the course of history. What would Iraq and Syria look like now? What might they look like if this new level of terrorism is achieved? Now, sabotage or cyber-sabotage is when an attacker or attackers conduct actions which compromise systems or machinery, for instance. So what kind of machinery? Think military equipment, hydropower, power, infrastructure, transportation, basically every single thing our lives revolve around and depend on a daily basis. Typically, the goal of the attacker is defamation, destruction, or blackmail of the victims. So what could happen in the future? Let's think back on that ISIS and American forces example I gave in relation to espionage earlier. There, terrorist forces would know of warfare tactics, but in sabotage, terrorists could gain access to military control and actually control and disable the signal, which flies drones, helicopters, planes, any form of military technology you could think of, they could get access to it. Imagine that. If forces or an entire country don't have the equipment to attack, how do you win? Now, cyber propaganda is slightly different than espionage or sabotage. Propaganda is also seen as a form of psychological warfare. What does that mean? Basically means that this form of terrorism is actions which includes actions to reduce the opponent's morale. Keep that in mind, reducing the opponent's morale. So this is essentially the spark, or the lighter that lights the metaphorical match of destruction, or, well, the match of terrorism. So let's think of well-known terrorist organizations such as the Taliban or Boko Haram or even the KKK as a business, yes, a business or a corporation. A business needs employees, no? And to gain employees, a recruitment process needs to be put into place, or an elucidation of the fact that the Al-Qaeda or the Ku Klux Klan are hiring. How does an international terrorist organization get the word out? ISIS, for example, has an online magazine found in the deep web called Dabiq. Yes, ISIS literally has its own magazine. But terrorist organizations are also very handy with hashtags. Yes, ISIS literally has Twitter accounts, and Tumblr accounts, and Instagram accounts, and Kik accounts, you name it. Twitter is actually scrambling to shut down Islamic State profiles which spew propaganda and advertise the brutal acts that the group commits. But another grand propaganda scheme is online videos or tutorials. Quite often, counter-terrorist experts refer to the news refer to the internet as terrorist university, where individuals can learn how to fabricate bombs with tools at home, or watch foreign fighters encouraging them to join the fight. Where is this going? Well, social media is booming, and it'll continue to grow and expand until it reaches every corner of the globe. This is heaven for terrorist organizations. Terrorism is heading in the direction of lone wolf attacks, which are already seen today, or a larger number of recruitments in the host country of war. After all, espionage and sabotage cannot happen without someone to sit behind the computer screen and carry out the actions. What's a business without employees? But what's a terrorist organization without terrorists. The thing about cyber terrorism is that there's much more ease to it. Why? Well, you choose. Would you rather attempt to fabricate bombs at home, purchase guns, or risk your own identity to be found? Or would you rather remain anonymous in the comfort of your own home? I believe the answer is pretty obvious. But that being said, what if your targets aren't found online? Or what if the point you were trying to make is different to the one seen in cyber propaganda? This is where chemical warfare is substituted onto the game and comes into play. So, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the future of terrorism, part 2, chemical warfare. Now, chemical warfare is just reviving, and countries all around the world are increasingly putting more pressure and more focus on chemical weapons. This form of warfare is the use of chemical agents as a weapon of war or terror. From the mustard gas used in World War I, to the highly lethal neurotoxin sarin, which is potentially available for use today and was used in Syria recently. These chemicals are actually considered a weapon of mass destruction. For many terrorist organizations, this is the ideal mode of attack. Why? Well, they're cheap, they're relatively accessible, and they're pretty easy to transport. An experienced chemist can easily fabricate or synthesize any form of chemical agents available to them and convert them into a deadly weapon. So as I was writing the script for this presentation, I stumbled upon a news article speaking of the Barcelona lone wolf attack, where an attacker drove a van into a downtown market, killing 13 pedestrians and injuring dozens others. I thought about what if this had happened with chemical weapons instead of a van. I essentially answered my own question about where the future of chemical warfare can go. Lone wolf attacks. This is similar to what's been seen nowadays in the media, with terrorists terrorizing their choice of location with their respective weapon. But this is exactly what can happen with chemical agents instead. So, scenario time. I know I've done a lot of these in the talk. Please bear with me. I barely have any other tricks up my sleeve. But imagine a chemistry graduate student who feels the need to advocate for a movement they really support. If they were to get their hands on certain chemical agents and utilize their abilities to synthesize them, they would have a severe lethal weapon on their hands, which would definitely aid in making their point, movement, or objective clear to their chosen audience. This is some really scary stuff. Something similar to this happened some time ago. In 1999, the Chechen terrorist organization set off 2 chlorine gas tanks in town in Russia. Thankfully, no one was affected due to favorable wind conditions. But, of course, it's important to consider the effects of chemical weapons in order to understand the magnitude of how awful these are. Well, the future attackers are essentially kids in a candy store, all with different desired effects for the victims if they were to choose their chemical agents. So, to name a few, blood agents. This causes rapid organ failure. Choking agents. Fluid builds up in the lungs, leading to choking and eventually death. Blister agents. These chemicals burn a person's mucous membranes, skin, eyes, as well as causing large, severe blisters on any exposed skin. Here's the scary part. When you inhale these chemicals as a vapor, the chemicals have the ability to burn your windpipe and lungs, leading to death. Nerve agents can cause paralysis, seizures, and loss of body control. This is by far the most deadly and requires the least amount of dosage to have the most amount of effects. This was the chemical agent used in the aforementioned chemical attack in Syria. So the attacker can essentially take their pick and carry out the attack. But as time goes on, this is likely going to become more and more prominent all around the world rather than small bombs or shootings. So, what does all of this mean? Truth is, I don't have all the answers. I'm not really sure how to fix this ongoing issue and this growing problem, or what the future of terrorism really does entitle. But what I am here for is elucidation. I think in terms of cyber terrorism, you all know how important internet security is, for example, now. But I sincerely do hope that this TED Talk has opened up your eyes and opened up your mind about what the future of terrorism looks like 10 years down the line. And who knows, maybe now you guys have some really cool dinner party anecdotes about the potential destruction of our society through cyber or chemical warfare. All sarcasm aside, I know that this is a lot to absorb. But I'd like for you to revisit that question I asked earlier. Is there more to terrorism than what meets the eye? Has your word association or interpretation of it changed? The point is that chemical warfare or cyber terrorism is our problem. And if you don't feel like it is, it certainly can become our problem. So, I'll bid you farewell with a quote said by Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War. He said, "Water shapes its course according to the nature of the ground over which it flows. Therefore, just as water retains no constant shape, so in warfare, there are no constant conditions." Thank you for your time.